Okay, it's time for episode 14. Chucky here as always, and Jigsaw as well.
Indeed I am.
Yep. Sounding like you just came back from a really good movie.
In a manner of speaking, yes.
Okay. Well, I don't know how you feel, so... Anyways, a new lineup of movies tonight, and I'll let you take it away.
Indeed. First up, we have the third Maniac Cop movie, Maniac Cop 3 Badge of Silence from 1993. Following that, we have the Abominable... Okay.
The Abominable Dr. Phibes.
A classic Vincent Price movie from 1971. Then we have Bloodsport II from 96, a inferior sequel to the original. Then a somewhat classic, modern-day classic werewolf movie, Ginger Snaps from 2000. And then lastly, the new release, which I just finished watching about an hour ago, It Chapter 2.
Okay, well, we'll get things started off with Maniac Cop 3, Badge of Silence from 1993. It centers around, the story centers around a female cop who's gunned down and wrongly accused of using excessive force in a hostage rescue attempt. Well, in some ways she is, in some ways she isn't. And Maniac Cop returns from the dead once more to seek revenge, destroying everything and anyone that stands in his way. And for some odd reason, it seems he wants a bride for... who the fuck knows, but...
Bride of Maniac Cop.
Yeah. This movie's clearly not as good as the first two. And there were a whole bunch of production issues, it seems. I believe Bill Lustig and who was it, Larry Cohen, who I think both of them directed and wrote the first two movies, and they started off with this movie. They filmed like half of it, and then they dropped everything and said, screw it, we're not going to finish this movie. And then I think the producer had to step in and kind of finish it himself. So he ended up filming a whole bunch of scenes to kind of finish off the movie, and I think they also spliced in just a little bit of scenes here and there from the second movie just to kind of pad it out. Yeah, the story is a little sillier. There's not a whole lot to it, and I mean, we talked about Chrome Skull Laid to Rest 2 a couple weeks back, and how that story kind of ruined that movie. I think the story for this one doesn't necessarily help this movie, but it doesn't have that much of an impact on how enjoyable it is either. It's just a bit of a stupid subplot that they've added. Anywho, I think it's an enjoyable movie. It's a little more generic, just a little more of a standard slasher with a lot less detail than the previous movies have. But yeah, I still think it's okay. I don't mind watching it. It's not great, but it's okay. What did you think of this one?
I think it's a bit enjoyable, but it's not necessarily a good movie though. My main problem is I don't think there's many likable characters here, and the whole thing bringing Cordell back by voodoo. I mean, and he could have said, he could have stayed dead if he wanted to, but he chose to came back. I mean, I don't know, I didn't care for the whole thing. I don't think it was explained particularly well. I mean, the story wasn't terrible. It was okay. I get why he wants to sort of help defend the honor of this cop, just like him, he views this cop as being unfairly treated. And I get that he wants to try to protect her and keep her safe, and then, I guess, make him a bride, or make her a bride. So, I don't know. I get it, but at the same time, I didn't really care for it that much.
I noticed in your review that you put on the website, you made a big point about cops and corruption and...
Yeah, so this is just a small thing, and I'm not trying to I actually intentionally left that alone. But my whole thing with this is the beginning the text at the beginning says that he was framed and then thrown into prison. And my thing was that we know he was an abusive cop. We saw evidence of it, so he obviously deserved to be in jail. Of course, there's some people who might believe the police can do what they need to do to criminals, but I mean, And Kodal's character obviously wasn't a good character. I appreciate he fought the corruption of the city, and that's a good thing, but he was also, police brutality poster boy, so that's a problem. And same thing with the female cop in the movie. What's her nickname? Maniac Kate, I think. Um, she got that nickname for a reason. And I know the cops laugh about it. Hey, let's just abuse potential, criminals. But I'm assuming she did some iffy things in her time. And though like I say in my review, she had every right to shoot when she shot the individual, who was trying to kill her. But she was using an illegal firearm and illegal ammunition. So even if she had the right to shoot, she should also still be in jail. So I don't know. Let's see. Did it bother me the first few movies? I thought Sam Ray, what's the guy's name? Bruce Campbell's cop character in the first movie. I thought he was okay. But this movie, I couldn't stand any of the characters. Then, especially once you got to the whole love story, halfway through the movie, that's just, in my opinion, somewhat cringe-worthy. So I don't know. It didn't do much for me. It's not like I hate the movie. I still think it's obviously below average, but it's not terrible. It's just a far cry from the first two movies, and the second movie's not even particularly good, but it's definitely the lowest of the three.
Hey, the second movie is good.
It does have that one guy in it though, so.
In a technical sense, you're probably right. They can be labeled corrupt. I guess the way I see it, though, and I know there's different levels to this, but I think a lot of what they do, and I guess we're assuming that they do other things to criminals who may not deserve it, but we don't see that, and we don't really know. But I think a lot of what they do is still whatever rules they break or whatever they've done to, apprehend a criminal or do whatever. It seems more in line with trying to just, serve justice than to do things for their own benefits.
I would not deny that in the moment, that's probably true in many cases. But keep in mind this, God, I forget the actor's name. He's such a decent actor too. Robert Davi. He tortured a guy in a hospital. It's not like he was trying to capture him. The guy was, he was not moving anywhere, and he's just torturing him just because he's a cop and he's pissed off. That's and then his doctor starts hitting on him 5 scenes later. It's oh God, it's just problematic. It's not a very good attitude for a doctor, in my opinion.
Well, to be honest, that guy deserved to die. I have very little sympathy for someone who goes into with a firearm to basically rob a pharmacy just to get their fix. To put people's lives at risk. He deserved to die, to be honest.
Well, if you agree with the death penalty, yes.
And the fact that he can sue the city and get millions of dollars. That just rubs you the wrong way as well.
His lawsuit, from my understanding, was pretty flimsy, though. He might have been able to do so, but from my understanding, there's no way that lawsuit ever would have actually worked, especially once that video got out.
Yeah, probably not, but, I just hate to see obviously bad guys get away.
And I feel like an argument could be made that it's not like these cops were necessarily the good guys. I know that in the framing of the story, they were the protagonists, but some of the behavior was, in my opinion, pretty antagonistic, and it's not necessarily uncommon for some police officers, but like I said, that's not the main reason why I dislike this movie. There was more to it, but it did rub me the wrong way.
And based on your review, you didn't seem to care too much for the fire stunt at the end.
See, I thought it looked cool for the first minute. I thought it was cool, but then it kept going and going. Is it just me? Was it too long?
Well, kind of, but I think that's the part actually that makes it cool, because you rarely ever see a scene in a movie with someone on fire for that long. And I know it's ridiculous, but at the same time, we're talking about essentially a zombie cop. So
Well,
it doesn't bother me too much that the car didn't blow up straight away or anything like that.
Well, I did say straight away, but I think eventually something would have happened. But maybe they make cars differently in that city than they do here. I mean, I don't know. I think I also say this in my review. If you like the first two Maniac Cop movies, you'll probably be okay with the third one. I just think it's pretty obvious, and I feel like I'm definitely not alone in this. That it's obviously the weakest of the three, and I suspect that if they remade the movie, I think they're talking about a remake, but I think they've probably been talking about it for years. But if they ever do remake it, I suspect even if that comes out, this will still be one of the worst Maniac Cop movies.
Yeah, that remake talk's been going on for ages, and suddenly it's happening, and then it's not happening, and
that's the joys of remakes.
Yeah.
That one scene, this is toward the end, like they sort of they're trying to break out of the hospital, where the guy is like hiding on the gurney and then just gets up and shoots, like that's pretty fun. And sort of like an action-oriented way, but I enjoyed that. I wish there was a little, more pop to it, but I enjoyed that. That was a fun time.
Yeah, there's a couple of decent scenes in the movie. Anywho's, like I've been saying, I think it's fairly enjoyable, but it's clearly the worst of the three movies. And my ratings for the first two, I give both of them a 9 out of 10, and so for this one, I give this one a 7 out of 10. So there is a clear drop off in terms of the quality of the movie. But overall, it's still okay. It's still enjoyable enough for me.
Giving Maniac Cop a 9 out of 10 is it's an amazing move. So this movie, it's okay. It's below average. Don't get me wrong, but it's enjoyable, and I can sort of see myself watching it again in the future. But there's so many other movies I'd much prefer to watch over this. I think there's decent things in it. I just think there's a problem with unlikable characters, somewhat unlikable situations, and I feel like the whole like voodoo brought back to life type thing wasn't really touched on as much as it probably should have been. Like if they had explained why he had switched from protecting this cop to wanting the cop to be his like wife type, I don't know, I just didn't get it. So I'll give this movie like a 5.5, and I'll round it up to a 6, which is still below average, but it's entertaining, and you can probably watch it a few times to enjoy it.
Yeah, it's got a few fun kills. Nothing all that memorable, but yeah, I think, like I said, if you enjoy the first two, you're going to have at least an okay time with this. It's not going to blow you away, but
I mean, honestly, we're looking like the early 90s, and there weren't really that many slasher-like movies in the early 90s, so if you have no other choice, you might as well go with it. Speaking about the early 90s, next movie we have is from the early 70s. How's that?
Okay, that makes a whole lot of sense.
So this movie is a Dr. Phibes movie.
What's it called? What's the full title?
It is indeed the Abominable. So, to any listeners, I have a difficult time pronouncing the word abominable. See, that's almost okay. I have to really stretch out though. So it's the Phibes movie. It's a sort of I feel like classic might be too strong a word, but it's a decently well-known movie, starring Vincent Price and a few other decent names.
Pretty much anything that has Vincent Price in it will really, have that classic tag to it, whether it is or isn't.
Yeah, I mean, and that makes sense. He was a fantastic actor, but it's an interesting movie. Basically, there's a bunch of doctors who are being killed in really bizarre ways. One, gets bitten to death and ripped apart by bats who are released in the room, and another gets stung to death by bees. And this police trying to investigate this, and they connect the cases, and they find out that all of these doctors were related to a case in which a young woman died, and they suspect that his or her husband is the one committing these acts against these doctors. So they try to race against the clock to save the last few doctors, and interesting things happen. It's a very unique movie. It doesn't feel like most other movies I've seen from that time, to be honest. I really like the creativity in their kills. There's a lot of really interesting ones. Like some really bizarre ones. The whole frog mask thing. The locust is always fun. It's like a snowblower and a cow. I mean, it's some really interesting and pretty memorable death scenes. Nothing particularly gory, but I mean that's not really what the movie is going out for. So I don't know. It's a pretty interesting movie, but before I jump too much more into it, what's your thoughts on this one?
You're probably surprised that I agreed to talk about this movie. It's not typically the type of movie I would watch.
Yeah, from my understanding, your range is like 1970s plus, so I knew this was like right on the cusp of, hey, does Chucky care about this movie or not? So, it's like a roll of the dice type thing.
Yeah. My wife's got this on Blu-ray, and every now and then she'll kind of mention it, say, hey, you should give it a watch, and she says it's kind of like a cross between Saw and Phantom of the Opera.
Yeah, I can see
which I guess, that seems fairly accurate. I like the idea of the story, especially for a movie from its time. This is the type of story that, like, I don't watch too many movies from the 60s and such. I know this is technically early 70s, but it still, to me, feels a little more like it's from the 60s. I don't know if that's because of the British aspect of it, or perhaps it was filmed in the late 60s and didn't come out till the 70s. I'm not so sure. But it just feels a little more 60s than it does 70s to me. But yeah, I do like the idea of the story. And some of the deaths in the movie, there's some good thought in those. I just don't necessarily think, like you said, because they're not particularly gory, or I wouldn't even go too far to say all that violent.
Well, there was a brass unicorn impaling someone.
Yeah. I mean, they're violent in one way, but still not. I mean, for me, I don't see too much violence on the screen in this particular movie, even though technically you could say, okay, well, all deaths are violent in one way or another, but
I did think the exsanguination was pretty, it was sort of a low key, but that was sort of a brutal scene, because the guy was alive for quite a bit of that, just getting his blood slowly drained away, so I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. The one guy who was earlier on in the film, one of the doctors that he was just drawing heaps and heaps of blood out of him. I was somewhat amused that guy barely even resisted. Like he sees Dr. Phibes come in, and is like, who's this? And then he doesn't even say, stop, what are you doing? No, he just like, who's this? And then is taking his blood.
The actor, I think it's Terry Thomas. The actor cracks me up in pretty much anything he's in. So he was pretty fun character here. I think he was sort of expecting the good time, and he just didn't quite get what he was looking for. He just too late. It's too late until he realized that, though.
Yeah. And there is a little bit of a comedy aspect to the movie as well, which I think as a whole didn't really do a whole lot for me, but there are a couple of moments in the movie which are worth giggling at. I think the one that stood out to me was I can't remember the detective's name, the main one, but he shortly after that scene that I was just talking about, he's talking to a lady and he's kind of guessing, is she the housekeeper, or and she just kind of gives him this like look like, you idiot, and then leaves. But
it's a little more subtle than what you might expect from nowadays, but the humor in this movie, in my opinion, is generally decently amusing. Like that one, I forget what his position is. He might be one of the chief detectives or something. But just the whole thing, hey, a unicorn was catapulted across London and impaired the surgeon. Words fail me, gentlemen. Which just sort of cracked me up. And the whole ludicrousness of a brass-plated unicorn being catapulted. It's funny. And it's like, and the whole thing with Phibes, playing that organ, and moving up and down, and I don't know, his character was I don't know if he's necessarily a memorable character, but it's quite interesting.
And I think towards the end of the movie, the kind of elaborate type ending for that guy. Well, I try not to spoil too much of it, but where he has to save his son. I mean, for a movie from its time, that seemed like a really intriguing type way to have a finale in a movie.
Yeah, and that's like pretty much like straight out of like a modern day Saw movie.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's been years since I've last seen this. I've seen this movie like I think I mentioned before the show. I've seen it like 3 or 4 times, but it's been at least like 5-6 years since I've actually last seen it, and I forgot entirely about that scene. So watching it, nowadays, like, oh hey, that's like, potentially where Saw got some ideas from.
Yeah. I'm not sure if this is because high definition or anything else, but the face reveal at the end, it pretty much looks like he's just wearing a mask.
It sort of does. I still like it. I think it's a pretty decent reveal. It's not like it's a surprise to anybody, but I thought it was pretty decent.
I mean, it still looks okay. It's just, I couldn't help but think, geez, it looks like he's wearing a mask rather than actually being, all messed up.
I did sort of like that flash mask he wore though, just, the ears and nose they just peels off. It sort of reminded me of The Invisible Man, actually, if you've seen that classic.
I think, once again, this is one of those movies where if the previous 50 years didn't exist, I think this would be a fantastic movie. But because it's still kind of just before that time where movies, I think horror movies really shifted and really changed with the music and the violence and the effects and everything. I think it's, like I said, it still feels like a 60s movie to me, and it just doesn't quite get there overall in terms of being entertaining from start to finish. I think there's a lot of moments in the movie where I'm kind of like, I want to see a little more. I want to see something more impactful than what I'm seeing on the screen.
So, this is a movie that I've never loved. I've seen it, like I said, multiple times before, but it never really hit all the right spots. I think it's interesting. I think it's a pretty memorable movie. I enjoy the humor, but it doesn't do that much for me. Part of it might be because Vincent Price's character doesn't really talk that much. His character can't really talk, but he can communicate via his vocal cords vibrating into a phonograph type thing. But it doesn't feel, I enjoy Vincent Price, but in this movie it's not really a fantastic portrayal, character portrayal. So I don't know, it's interesting, but I much prefer movies like, House on Haunted Hill or Theater of Blood. Those are, in my opinion, much better Vincent Price movies. I don't know, this movie is decent, and it's a movie that I've seen before and I'm probably going to see again many times, but I still don't enjoy it that much, and I sort of see it around average, so I'll probably give it like a 7 out of 10.
Well, I'm not going to give it the completely terrible rating that you may be expecting from me. I'm going to give it a 5. I was considering a 4, but I'll give it a 5. I think it's, for its time, it's a pretty decent movie. I mean, when I compare it to being like a cross between Saw and Phantom of the Opera. I mean, Phantom of the Opera is something that's I've never really been into any version of that story at all. But when I think of Saw, I'm thinking of the elaborate traps and the violence and stuff, and it didn't necessarily need to be gory or anything, but I just thought there was potential to be a little more violent than what it ended up being. I had an okay time with it. I can't see myself wanting to watch it, too many times again in my life, but I wouldn't be surprised if maybe I come across it another time, many, many years down the track, and I'll be okay with seeing it again. But I must say, the one thing about some of these older movies from 60s, 70s, or maybe even earlier than that, sometimes they have some really good-looking women in the movie, and I don't know if we saw Dr. Phibes' wife more than outside of a picture in this movie, but yeah, she looked pretty good.
I think we did see her corpse a few times, but you're probably not a necrophiliac guy, so.
Nah, the corpse didn't really do anything in terms of increasing my blood flow to a certain area.
Well, speaking of blood flow, what's this next movie?
Yes, we've got the sequel to Bloodsport. So this is Bloodsport II from 1996. The story centers around a thief, Alex Cardo, who is betrayed by his partner in crime and is caught stealing an ancient sword. Alex is then imprisoned and attacked regularly. One of the prison guards, who goes by the name Demon, he takes plenty of opportunities to ensure Alex's time in prison is not pleasant. And then Alex is befriended by an old man who becomes his mentor and teaches him a superior fighting style. And then soon enough, Demon is invited to the Kumite, and with some outside help, Alex also gets released from prison to compete in that same tournament. And there's also this other subplot where he needs to retrieve the ancient sword that was stolen earlier in the movie. Now, I hadn't seen this movie since it was a new release. In fact, I can't even recall if I saw this one or if it was the other sequels, but I have to believe that I saw all of the sequels. I know I definitely saw some of them, and clearly it wasn't great enough for me to say, hey, I really want to see this again. But then again, I would have been a kid at that time. I probably was 12 years old. So who knows? I was actually surprised that I thought the first half of this movie was actually somewhat enjoyable. Certainly not as good as the original Bloodsport, but I think Daniel Bernhardt, the guy playing Alex, the main character in the movie, he does okay in this movie. But the whole time I kept thinking, geez, he literally looks like he's trying to copy Van Damme, even though he's not playing the same character. Like, a lot of the mannerisms and the way he's talking, even the way he's kicking, and even the little, it all sounds like a copy of Van Damme's character from the first movie. I don't know, that kind of stuck with me, but I was surprised to see a lot of familiar faces in this movie, because, like I said, I hadn't seen it in 20-something years, so I'd forgotten everything about it, other than the fact that it certainly wasn't as good as the first movie.
So I think Bloodsport was one of the first non-horror movies we spoke about way back in the first show, and I may have surprised people when I gave it a pretty high rating. I really enjoyed that movie, and this sequel in comparison seems like such a drop down. I mean, this, and maybe it's just because I watched a bad version of the movie, but this really seems just like a really shitty TV movie, that you might find on late night TNT, and you flip off halfway through. It just, I don't know, so much of it. I mean, the fighting was enjoyable, as enjoyable as somewhat repetitive fighting can get. And some of the fighters were pretty interesting. That monkey guy annoyed the hell out of me, so I'm happy he lost his first round. But I know there's some decent characters here, but I don't know, just the movie as a whole felt so much worse. And also, I hated the whole framing thing. This is a person who is both bad and good, children. It's just, it's so cringy. I couldn't take it.
Yeah, the funny thing about this movie is the more and more it went along, the more and more it... I don't know if it was just copycatting the original movie or if it was trying to pay homage to it, but like you said, they've got this Monkey Man type fighter who's an even more ridiculous version of a fighter from the original movie who did have that similar type of monkey style. There's also a scene in which Demon, the main bad guy fighter in the movie, he kills someone, and a very similar reaction to Chong Li in the first movie, how everyone turned his back on him. And
actually, I just want to say one quick thing. Demon, that guy was one of the most ridiculous antagonists I've ever seen. All he does is doing that arm thing. Yeah, hey, look at me. It's all he ever did, with that stupid smile on his face. I just hated that guy so much. But he was just so ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen him in a couple of things before. I think it was in that Bruce Lee movie, with who was it? I forget the guy's name now. Is it Jason Scott Lee? Yeah. Anyways, I'm not even sure if I remember his name, if that was it. But anyways, I think he's okay in the movie. He's certainly like a cheaper version of a Chong Li, clearly. Really, everyone in this movie is a cheaper version of a similar type character from the first movie. I mean, there's a number of different people in here that are recognizable to me. Obviously, Pat Morita, we all know him from Karate Kid and some other movies. We see Donald Gibb return, which is kind of nice, but doesn't have the same impact he had on the first movie. But it's nice to see him in this movie. He adds a little bit of a comedic value, I guess. And then in fact, one of the funniest things about it is the old guy telling the story for this movie. The mentor from prison. This is an actor by the name of James Hong, and he's quite. He's been in quite a lot of things, and a lot of people will probably know him as what's his character's name in Big Trouble in Little China?
David Lo Pan.
That's it, Lo Pan. Yeah. The funny thing is, the first movie that I ever recall seeing this actor in is Revenge of the Nerds 2. And in that movie, he plays this ridiculous sensei-type character, but he doesn't teach martial arts. Instead, he teaches how to be slovenly. like his scenes in that movie are just him like picking his nose and doing these epic burps. So anytime I see him in a movie, that's what I'm thinking of. This ridiculous character from Revenge of the Nerds 2. Anyways, it didn't hurt my how much I enjoyed the movie, but it's just kind of funny to think about that. But yeah, there's still some other guys in here. I noticed one guy was in a scene from A Dangerous Place, which we reviewed a couple months back, and there was a black guy in this movie. I don't remember his name, but he was pretty impressive in terms of his fighting skill.
There's actually two impressive black fighters in this movie. I thought the other guy, the guy who had very fluid movements, that guy was pretty interesting.
Yeah. But I think overall, there's some decent fighting skill showcased in this movie. I think the problem is that pretty much all the characters lack charisma.
Yeah.
And that was a big thing from the first movie. Even though I wouldn't say Chong Li in the first movie was, impressing people with his fighting style, but he just had that charisma to his character that just made him seem like such a bad guy. Like, he didn't have to really say or even do all that much just to look like a really bad guy. And same with Van Damme, he's got that goofy nature about himself where it didn't really matter whether he was fighting or talking. He was just always interesting to kind of see on the camera. And we just don't really have that here.
I was just going to say my favorite scene in this movie might have been... it's a small scene with he beats this one guy, but the guy still wants to fight. But then the referee just comes down, sort of kicks his ass and just tells him, hey, get out. That's probably my favorite scene in this one.
You suck when the referee's kicking your ass. I mean, the music in this movie, it's pretty generic stuff. I thought the original movie had some decent tunes, and this one didn't really have any that stood out.
It just hit me that when I was watching the beginning of this movie, I thought I was watching like a TV remake of The Shawshank Redemption. This guy getting taken to prison, and it seemed like some prison drama for a bit, and it's just... I think we can maybe both agree that the whole subplot with the getting the sword back was not that great. And I think it was really a mistake to have the whole framing sequence. I don't really think that added anything to the movie. And just made the ending like even worse. Like, oh, did they kiss? And then, oh, they kissed. Oh, God.
You loved it.
That's exactly what I'm feeling right now. I liked seeing Gabe's character coming back. I just wish he had actually been a fighter and not just pants. I wish he did a bit more. And I know we saw some action toward the end during the epic shootout, but I don't know, I just wish he did more than he did. All he did was like go after that one woman fighter for like the whole movie, and then he finally gets her because of course he does. And that was not enough for me, to be honest.
He's more interested in getting laid. I thought Bloodsport 2, the first half was enjoyable enough, but the more and more the movie went on, I just felt like it was just a very cheap carbon copy of the original. Like I was saying, there's a lot of different either characters or moments in the movie that actually happened in the original, and they just seem like just a cheap imitation of those. So I thought the second half of the movie, it just kept kind of going a bit downhill to the point where you're like, didn't do a whole lot for me. But I thought overall it was okay. I'm going to give it a 6. It's certainly nowhere near as good as the original, which I gave a 9. So I think going from a 9 to a 6 is a pretty decent indication of how far this one drops off from the original.
I'm actually going to give it the exact same rating as 6. I think it's enjoyable enough if you watch it, the fighting scenes are fun. I mean, that's why you're watching a Bloodsport movie. It's just, like Chucky says, if you've seen the first movie, there's really no reason to see this one. And, I don't know, it's enjoyable at parts, it's just a low-budget action movie, but it's okay. So, I mean, it's a below-average movie, but it's enjoyable, so 6 seems okay.
And until... I don't know how quickly you want to go into Bloodsport 3, but...
I'll be honest, until recently I had no idea there was like 18 Bloodsport movies. So.
Well, how many is there? There's at least 4 that I can remember.
I just remember seeing the name, the dog Kumite, or however you pronounce it.
Kumite.
Yes.
Yeah.
That might be the 4th one, but God. Hopefully they're better than this one. I mean, I guess you've probably seen them, but...
Yeah, like I said, I've seen a couple of them, but they're all back in like the 90s when I saw them, so I haven't really seen any of them since then outside of the original, which I watch somewhat regularly.
That is not particularly encouraging. Next up, we have like I mentioned in the beginning, somewhat of a modern day classic, being Ginger Snaps, which is a Canadian werewolf movie starring Emily Porkins and Catherine Isabelle. People would probably recognize Emily Porkins as playing Beverly in the 1998 series. She played the young version of Beverly, so it's sort of nice to see her like 10 years later still acting, and she pretty much looks the same, to be honest.
Yeah, she looks like Beverly got 10 years older.
And also I've always sort of liked Catherine Isabelle. I haven't seen her in that many things, but I think she's sort of fun. So basically these two sisters are both sort of like outcasts in the city. They're both sort of like death obsessed. They don't really fit in with anybody. So one night one of them gets attacked by a creature which turns out to be a werewolf. And then through the course of the movie, this one sister starts exhibiting more and more sort of werewolfish traits, and the other sister's trying the best that she can to save her sister. I mean, these are very, close siblings, but they're getting further and further apart, and will she be able to save her sister from the curse of the werewolf? That's a suspenseful question. It's a movie I've seen, 3 or 4 times, and I'm not really big on werewolf movies, but this one I think is actually really decent. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, but my main thing is I think the relationship between Emily Porkins and Catherine Isabelle's characters, I think it's just fantastic. It's a very, in my opinion, emotional movie at times, especially the conclusion. I mean, because these sisters are like the best friends, and in fact, really the only friends each other has, and then something completely outside of their control comes in, and it just really screws up everything. So I don't know. I think the main performances really make this movie a better movie than what many other werewolf movies might be.
I'm the same with werewolf movies. I'm not a huge lover of that particular subgenre. But this one is probably my favorite werewolf movie, if I had to pick one. I saw it when it first came out back in like the early 2000s. I just randomly picked it up on DVD because it was a cheap DVD that was on this shelf. I was like, I'll give this a watch. And no, I really enjoyed it. And the fact that right now I've got a daughter the exact same age as as these girls in this movie, I'm starting to see a lot of some of the same traits, not necessarily all the bad ones, but in terms of attitude and yeah, no, it was a lot easier now to relate to how these girls are.
It's actually a fair point, and if I can just quickly touch upon that, I can imagine part of this movie is somewhat awkward for guys in general, because it's a decent amount dealing with the effects of puberty, and it's very crystal clear, it's a lot of sort of womanly talks in this movie. It sounds so sexist now that I think about it. But there's a lot of stuff in this movie that I think a lot of guys might not necessarily be the most comfortable with if they're not, really into, if they haven't had those conversations themselves with anybody. So I sort of really like that more, interesting perspective that we don't see all that often.
I mean, I also didn't mind the character. What's his name? The actor Chris Lemke, I think is the actor's name. But his character in the movie was also enjoyable. I thought, the kind of low-key drug dealer trying to help.
Low-key drug dealer. I guess it's the most obvious drug dealer I've seen.
Well, he's trying to keep everything on the down low. Not doing a great job. He's got this huge facility growing all of his pot, and
that guy. I really like that character. I mean, and he legitimately seemed to try to help. But he might be I don't know. Was he actually attracted to the sister or not? It's an interesting question.
I don't think so. Anywho, but the very first moment we see his character in the movie, and this probably has no bearing on your enjoyment of this character, but as he arrives on the scene, he storms in on his van, and he's got his music cranked up loud, and for me, the thing about it is the song that he's listening to. This is before I even first saw the movie. I was obsessed with that album that song is from. And that song in particular, I think it's probably the best song on the album. It's from a band called Glassjaw, and the album's entitled Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Silence. It's a fantastic album. It may or may not be your thing, but for me, it's the best album ever created, and the fact that this guy's listening to it just catapulted him into my favorite character of all time.
I do believe I've only heard a single song by Glassjaw, and I do believe I hated it. So, unfortunately, off the top of my head, I cannot remember which song it was. So I'm sad.
Yeah. Anywho, that really got him off to a good first impression with me. Yeah. I mean, with this movie, I think it has a good progression of the difference. There's different stages to her developing into this werewolf, and it's kind of nice just to see that slow, I'm starting to get hair, I'm starting to get a tail, and now I'm starting to really get hungry for blood, and all those kind of different things happening, and I think it has a pretty good build up to the ending, which, I mean, the ending I don't think is fantastic, but I don't think the ending is the best part of the movie. I think everything leading up to the ending is the most enjoyable part, and I mean the werewolf action at the end it's okay as well, but it was more the characters, I think, that made the movie pretty enjoyable, as opposed to eventually seeing werewolf action at the end.
Yeah, I think what really brought this movie was it really, the werewolf action. It was the connection to the characters. I mean, even the mother was such an interesting character, especially toward the end. Like, she has like a really what the fuck line toward the end that, like I said, I'd seen this movie before, but I forgot about that line. I'm watching, like, wait, what the hell am I watching? Like, so she's very interesting characters, and I don't know, it's sort of, I don't know, it's a very, in my opinion, the dialogues. It just feels like a pretty solidly written movie.
It's kind of funny that their mum kind of went from 0 to 100. Like she seems like the most homely person, and then all of a sudden at the end she's talking about blowing up their house.
And it's the conversation is so casual too. Like it'll be fun, you know, it'll be fun. We can like move to a new place. We can. But what about Dad? Well, it's fun.
The dad's kind of funny too, even though he has a very limited scenes. But yeah, he has a couple of lines here and there that you kind of giggle at. Yeah,
I think probably one of my favorite lines in the movie was, you know, when the mother's about to open the fridge and the corpse is there. It's like, and Porkins' character's like, "What do guys want?" You can just see that look on the mom's face. Oh, she finally wants to talk about guys. It's adorable.
Towards the beginning of the movie, I believe it's the first scene where they're playing like hockey out on the field or whatever that game was that they're playing.
Probably called field hockey.
Field hockey, yeah. And not that this is a big thing, it's just something that kind of raises a question. When she gets pushed on that dead dog, I'm kind of thinking, like, how did no one else see this dead dog on the field?
I guess they're too focused on the park.
Yeah, but I mean, there were already people playing on the field while they were just off to the side talking to each other, and that's well before this, you know, they stumble on this dead dog, which is obviously on the field. So I'm wondering how the hell could they be playing this game for what could be already half an hour and not have even noticed this dead dog?
Yeah, I think that's I when reading about like thoughts about this movie, that comes up a lot, and I really have no idea how people missed it. I'm just gonna assume they're too focused on the fun of the game.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, like I said, it's not a big deal. It's not something that's like, oh my god, that just ruins everything. But you know, it's just something you can't help but think about.
I think it's a pretty fantastic movie. I really enjoyed this. Lot of characters I enjoy. I think it's not perfect, but it's probably the closest modern day werewolf movie has gotten to perfect. To be honest, werewolf movies they have a difficult history. There's not that many great ones out there, and some of the ones that people say are great, such as An American Werewolf in London or The Howling, neither one's particularly amazing in my opinion.
Yeah.
But this movie's pretty good. And like I say, what really makes it work is the relationship between Emily Perkins and Catherine Isabel. I think those two young actresses did a fantastic job here. I I really liked Catherine Isabel's really snappy dialogue. And I don't know, I really like the relationship between the sisters. And honestly, I think the movie has sort of a tragic feel to it that not many other horror movies do. So I really enjoyed this one, and I would give it an 8.5. And I'm going to round it up to a 9 out of 10. I think it's a fantastic movie and definitely worth watching.
Yeah, no, I enjoy this one too. I give it an 8 out of 10. Yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot more I can say about it that I haven't already said, but
play safe.
If you want my general thoughts, go listen to the previous 10 minutes. But no, the characters are good in this movie. At least the main characters, they really are what make up the majority of this movie and why it's enjoyable. So, just watching them and their progression of dealing with her transformation, and yeah, it's all entertaining and riveting stuff. So. Anyways, next up we've got the final movie for today's show, It Chapter 2. So 27 years after their first encounter with the terrifying Pennywise, the Losers Club have all grown up and they've all moved away. Well, except for one. But then one by one, they receive the devastating phone call to return home because, well, it's back. Now, the first chapter to this I really loved, and I gave it a perfect 10 out of 10. And so I am a little disappointed in this one. I still think overall it's a pretty decent movie. But I think it's clearly not as good as that first chapter. And once again, I don't know if it's for the exact same reasons as the original miniseries as to why it doesn't work as well, but it's just something about these adult characters that is just less... It's less riveting than the children's story of all their encounters. And another part, I think, is that in the second chapter, we see more of what Pennywise is underneath, which I think the most interesting thing about Pennywise is his clown form, at least for me. I don't necessarily care too much about what he is underneath. So we see a lot more of him in like a lot more situations where there's a lot of heavy CGI, and I don't know, it just doesn't do as much for me as the first movie does.
So this is a movie I saw about, I finished watching an hour before we started the show. It was an okay theater experience, but this movie, there's some things I'm trying to digest from it. There was some probably unnecessary additions that felt, I don't know, I don't think we needed some of this stuff. This, I don't know, there's some things in this movie that I really enjoyed, and some other things that were not in the book, so they added some things that, were different, like hey, you have to find these totems before you can do this ritual, and I don't know, just almost had sort of like a video game feel to it. Like, hey, we have to find this before we can go on to the final boss. One thing I did like, this had some additional flashbacks from when they were kids that we didn't see in the first movie. And I pretty much liked all of those scenes, and somewhat ironically, I think those scenes were some of the best in the movie. When we get to see, them as kids again, especially like the whole clubhouse scene. I enjoyed that.
There's a number of different points to talk about here. So I think one of the things that they've done best for this movie is the casting for the movie. Pretty much everyone looks like a good older version of their younger self, with possibly, well, if I had to pick one that I didn't necessarily fully believe, is probably the one for Ben. I know, his character, he's lost all his weight and stuff, but I don't know. I don't buy that little porky fella turning into this like guy with chiseled abs. In the original 90s miniseries, we've got John Ritter playing that same type of character, and I think he's a little more believable as like a fat kid who is kind of, not, or is at least lost some weight, or slimmed down a little bit as an adult, but I don't know. His character just seemed a little bit far-fetched. But outside of that, I think the way that the grown-up actors look, they just look like accurate representations of their younger characters.
Yeah, I think two of the best ones was probably obviously Richie and Bill Hader, and the guy who played Addie, which looks like James Ranson. I'm not really familiar with either one, but I thought both of those actors did really decent jobs, so I was happy with it.
I'd say probably Bill Hader had the best performance in the movie, or at least most enjoyable. But then again, that's a character of Richie. I think he has that leg up in terms of being more enjoyable, because one is obviously that he's funny, and that when he gets to a point where he's trying to be, or he's showing all his emotions, it may hit you a little harder than the rest because you're just so used to seeing him be that fun-loving guy, and then...
Yeah, I think that toward the end of the movie, where he's having sort of like a very emotional scene, it's I think a very heavy-hitting scene, and, everybody else is, sort of happy and trying to be happy and smiling. This guy's just like crying, and that scene just hit me. It's a very well-done scene.
Another scene that I mentioned in my review, the suicide scene that we all know from in the miniseries, that particular scene is one of my favorites, and it didn't quite have the same impact this second time around. They didn't shoot it, in the exact same type of way. So, in the original, you've got the blood of it on the wall and the blood-curdling screams, and that scene in the original really gets to me, and that scene in this movie just is a bit disappointing that it didn't kind of do anything.
I think one of the reasons the 90s version works out maybe a bit better is because, if I recall, that was the ending of part 1.
Yeah.
Because there's a mini-series, that was the end of part 1, and it ends in such, everybody's getting the phone call, and this last guy to get the phone call, and then we see what happens to him, and that music in the background, and, like you say, the shrieking, like, everything about it, it's just fantastic. And this one, and this may be a little reason for it giving toward the end, but it wasn't nearly as, I guess, shocking. I mean, pretty much, we are obviously Beverly saw it coming, so.
I mean, we've got this kind of running joke throughout the movie about Bill's endings always sucking, and I don't know exactly, are they referencing something to do with Stephen King there, or are they referencing the original miniseries that it didn't end well, or...
There's a lot of critics who say that Stephen King can write a really good book until he gets to the ending, which, in my opinion, and speaking of which, keep eye out for the Stephen King cameo in the movie. It's pretty funny. But so yeah, a lot of people said about some of his books, and for some of them you can sort of see why they might say that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of endings, I mean, this one probably has a better ending than the original miniseries, but I still don't think they nailed it. It just didn't have the impact that I was looking for.
Yeah, so this one thing I want to say about that, I've mentioned before, and I know that you've not read the book, but it's probably one of my favorite books. And the ending to that book, like the last 15 pages, it's just gut-wrenching. It's almost some of the saddest material I've ever read. And a movie, nothing I've seen has ever quite captured that. One thing I want to point out, there's a scene toward the end of this movie where Bill is writing his book. And that what he's writing on that page is actually a quote from the original Stephen King's It book. So I doubt that you necessarily had time to read the quote, but it was sort of nice to see a very direct reference to his book in the movie. So I enjoyed that.
I'm sure he enjoyed that too. This is a really long movie, almost 3 hours long,
and it's still too short.
Yeah, to be honest, I didn't really actually notice the long runtime as I was watching it. It did kind of fly by pretty quickly for me, so I guess that at least indicates that the movie is still pretty decent.
Yeah, my one caveat, toward the end when this, like, they journey into the psychic cave of Pennywise, it gets a bit I think you used the term out there, and I think it's pretty accurate. It gets a bit strange at times. It loses a bit of its, not necessarily coherency, but it doesn't feel quite as rooted in what we're used to, as the movie usually is. So that was, I mean, it wasn't a bad thing. It's just something that it's going to take a little getting used to, with new additions to this version of the story.
When I saw this at the theater, there was clearly a lot of people who loved the first movie, and well, there was even one woman dressed as Pennywise in the crowd. Pretty good costume she had on.
That is creepy.
Looked pretty much exactly like him in the movie, so she did a good job there. But anywho's, the fact that some of the crowd was even clapping at the credits, I was thinking, I think you're a little blinded by your love for that first movie, because I really don't think they nailed this movie. I think they did a decent job. It's an enjoyable second chapter to that movie, but it's I think it's very clearly not as good as the first chapter. So
there's about 6 things I want to say. One, I just remember, because I'm still trying to digest a lot of this. It's like almost a 3-hour movie, so there's a lot, that you can forget. The way that they finally defeat Pennywise, and I don't feel like that's a spoiler because the poster literally says it ends. So, spoiler is Pennywise is defeated. The way they finally defeat him just felt sort of ridiculous to me. And a lot of people make their own choices, with that, but I don't know, I I didn't care for that whatsoever.
No, I didn't really either.
Like at least in the 90s adaptation, which I will state the 90s adaptation is probably, at least in the finale, it's probably closer to the book than this one was. This one tried to throw in the ritual of Trod, but or I think they pronounced it Trude, but um it was done in a way that was sort of quite a bit different than the way the book uses it. So I don't know, it's interesting that the way they tried to adapt it here, but I don't know if it really worked entirely.
Yeah, and another thing is, I mean, you know me in terms of music. I thought the first chapter had really great music, and a lot of its returns in the sequel, like they chop it up and recycle it and put it back in this movie, but it just doesn't quite to have the same impact on the scenes. Also, yeah, the music just wasn't as enjoyable the second time around as it was in the first movie. Yeah, you probably didn't notice too much about that.
I do remember now. There was one scene which had sort of like a comedic use of music. Like I can't remember for the life of me what that scene was, but it's like this like 3 second blast of music, and then it just goes on to the next scene. But I mean, otherwise, music was okay. I didn't have any big problem with it. Just another random thing. I did appreciate seeing the Paul Bunyan statue coming after Richie. That was something that was in the books that obviously the 90s adaptation didn't do, because 90s adaptation didn't have the budget for it. And though I agree that a lot of the CGI in this movie was a bit iffy, I was actually okay with that sequence.
Yeah.
Obviously, I don't think they could have done it any other way to begin with, but I actually think that sequence, aside from the somewhat strange singing and dancing, but um, I don't know. Aside from that, I sort of enjoyed the scene Paul Bunyan coming after Richie. I had good times.
Yeah. Well, I think in the first chapter, like I was saying earlier, there's Pennywise is, you know, he's really what people, I think the majority of people want to see. Like, they don't necessarily want to see him turn into this creature or whatever. Well, I mean, I could be wrong, but that's just me. But and in the original movie, we see a lot of Pennywise, and he tends to take the form of the clown in most, you know, not all the time, but most of the screen time in the first chapter. And in this one, there's really only, just off the top of my head, and there's probably maybe one or two more, but there's really only two standout scenes that I can recall off the top of my head with Pennywise in this movie. One being in the initial opening sequence, and where he attacks someone, and then later on that what was it, a firefly or something?
Yes.
That scene there. But outside of those two, it didn't feel like he was in the movie all that much. Or like, well, he was, but he was taking forms of all these other different, you know, generic creature type things, and yeah, it's just kind of disappointing that you don't see him as much.
I did enjoy actually, just to mention two things. I really like the opening scene. The opening scene to this movie was one of the earliest scenes in the books also, so it's nice to see them finally sort of bring that to life. And it happened mostly the same way in the book as it did here, so it was sort of nice to see. Um, and this scene was new. This scene wasn't in the books, but it scene the flashback with Ban and Beverly at the school. I guess it was like a summer school type thing. I thought that was not necessarily a standout scene, but I thought it was pretty interesting. And I sort of enjoyed like the shadow on the projector, and it's just Beverly, and well, you see what happens. But I sort of enjoyed that. I think the most random one off the top of my head was probably the whole thing with Addie and the basement of the pharmacy. Like that scene was just sort of, it was okay, but it just seemed so strange to me. They probably could have done that a bit better, just changed it or something. I didn't care too much for that sequence. I also sort of I sort of like how I'm like crazy Mike. He's, hey guys, you've got to like listen to me and stand. Like everybody's, dude, we're just leaving. I felt bad for the guy during those scenes.
Yeah, I thought this movie was a little messy though, in terms of just they have to go do this. Okay, now we have to go do this. Like, we see Bill go kind of retrieve that boat, and the boat that he made for Georgie, and then later on he's like, oh, now I'm gonna go to this fair and save this random kid. And
well, I mean, obviously I feel like the kid just reminded him of George, so that's probably why he...
Yeah, it's just, I don't know, it just seemed like, I don't know, it's just kind of going through the motions. Let's find a way to put this in the movie. And
that actually reminds me of something. The whole subplot with Henry Bowers, I thought it started out good, but then like it was pretty much, I don't know, pointless. He didn't honestly do that much to impact anything. Like in the original, and in the book, he puts Mike in the hospital, but here he just he like fights a bit with Addie, fights a bit with Mike, but both of them are perfectly fine to go down to the I don't know, he seemed almost pretty pointless, to be honest.
Well, the weird thing about the crowd in the theater was that, man, they were laughing uncontrollably at that scene where Bowers is attacking Eddie. I'm like, I know there's a couple of like things to maybe giggle at in the movie, but they were just like laughing like it's a comedy movie. I'm like, what is wrong with these people?
I'm very happy I did not see this movie with your crowd.
Yeah. Like, it just felt like they were a little too blinded by their love or wanting to love the movie, that they just had to laugh at everything. And, like I said, some of them gave it a standing ovation at the end. I'm like, it wasn't... This is not a 10 out of 10 movie. I didn't feel the need to, get up and clap.
This movie is a movie that I'm still in the process of trying to digest. There's still a lot of things I'm thinking about. There's quite a few big changes from the book and the original 90s adaptation that I need to consider. I'm not sure how much I like some of it, but then again, some of it was very, almost sort of brave what they changed. So, for the time being, I'm just going to give this a 7, which is an average rating, and that may go up or down the more I think about this movie. So maybe, next week it might finally amount to like an 8. But for now, I feel like a 7 is okay. And that's all I have.
And you gave Chapter 1 an 8 out of 10, didn't you?
Either an 8 or an 8.5, I forget.
But it was higher rating than this one.
Yes.
Yeah, so for now, you're saying, okay, Chapter 1 was still better.
Yeah, and actually, that just reminds me of one thing. There was one scene I neglected to mention that I thought was really funny. The scene when the adults get to the clubhouse, when Richie makes sort of like a joke, Pennywise type joke, and like everybody's like, "Dude, what the fuck are you doing?" And I really like you say, he's really a standout in this movie, and the guy just consistently cracked me up. But yeah, the best parts of this movie, in my opinion, were probably when the flashbacks when they were kids. That's when I had the most fun, and obviously the first movie did that a lot more than this one did.
And the scene where he was swearing at that kid as they're leaving the restaurant. It's like, fuck you!
I felt bad for that kid. Well, actually, I felt worse for the parents, to be honest.
You want a picture with me? Anywho, yeah, no, I'm giving this one for now an 8 out of 10. Like you said, it may take a little time to digest, and who knows, maybe a year or two later down the line we think a little differently of it. But the first chapter, I saw that 3 times in the theater, and this one, I don't have the urge to actually go see this again in the theater. So I think it's quite clearly, for me, nowhere near as good as that first chapter. And even, I would say, IMDb is indicating rather quickly that there's a lot more mixed feelings about this one than the first chapter. Because the first day the ratings, or the first day you were able to rate this movie on IMDb, I first noticed it was like an 8.2 or something out of 10. It was 8 point something out of 10. And now, 3-4 days later, it's already dropped to below what Chapter 1 has. And it's down to a 7.3. And Chapter 1's got a 7.4. And it's only going to go more and more down. So I think that's another indication that this second chapter didn't quite nail it.
Which is really disappointing, given or obviously the fact that they really had an opportunity to do this when what the 90s version couldn't do. And I would say that this is probably better than the adult portion of the 90s miniseries, but even that's somewhat questionable in my opinion, which shows how mixed I sort of find the whole movie.
Yeah, and I think when you think about it, this new version, both movies combined, Chapter 1 and 2, is well over 5 hours worth of runtime there between both of them. And the original miniseries is, less than 3 hours or thereabouts, so about half the amount of time. So they clearly had the extra time to put more into it, and yeah, like I said, they just didn't nail this one, and which is a little disappointing, but I think Chapter 1 is... I'll keep going back to watch that one, but I don't know how often I'll go back to watch this one.
I mean, the more I think about it, the way that they end up defeating Pennywise, I'm surprised past audiences liked that, and I'm just surprised that was what they went with. It just feels almost so weak to me. Like, I don't know, just that part more than anything just sort of bothers me.
So now when they reference, bad endings, they can kind of attribute it to this one as well.
Yeah, so here's a somewhat amusing story about my theater experience. So I went and when I was in the theater, there's maybe 15 to 25 other people. I saw this at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and they were showing the movie later, like at 8 p.m. So most people probably going to the 8 p.m. showing. So this early showing, there's very few people there. Toward the end of the movie, about 25, maybe 35 minutes, to go in the movie, this bunch of teenagers walk in. And they walk in, they go to one of the top rows, and about something like 15 minutes later, I think they realize, oh shit, this is not the beginning of the movie. So by that point, they already spoiled some massive plot points. So I'm looking to the side, and this is whole line of 15 high school kids just walking out of the theaters again. I sort of felt bad for them, but they came in on their cell phones, and they're talking to, hey, shouting, hey, we're up here, I'm happy that they left, but that's just sort of an amusing. I just couldn't believe the whole group came in toward the end of the movie, thinking, oh hey, this must be the beginning.
Well, at least that was more amusing than annoying, unlike
yes.
the teenagers who turned up in the last 20-30 minutes of Annabelle Comes Home when I saw that in the theaters. And they not only did they come into the theater, they came and sat pretty much right next to me. And
you're just a likable guy.
They just did not shut the fuck up. To the point where I actually had to tell them, hey, shut up.
Yeah, it's always interesting. I don't go to the theaters very often. I think I mentioned I've been to the theaters twice this year. I went to go see Child's Play, and I went to go see It Chapter 2. And I may or may not go to the theaters again this year. I don't know. I always try hard not to let the audience's attitudes or let them disturb my perception of the movie. But in some cases, especially during particularly rowdy crowds, I can imagine it's quite difficult. I do remember I saw The Woman in Black from Trying to 12. I saw that one in theaters. When I went to go see that, there was a bunch of high school kids, me being a high school kid myself at that time. But, I mean, at least I was annoying, these other high school kids were, so... I mean, jumping at every jump scare and screaming, and I'm just, shut the fuck up and watch the movie. That's one nice thing about... I like seeing the movie in theaters, I just hate the people.
Yeah, no, I'm the same way. I try to go at times where it's going to be likely to be fairly quiet. Which is kind of funny, because I caught the very first session of Child's Play, and I was the only one there, obviously, aside from my wife, but we were the only two people in the theater, which is great.
It's a nice private showing. That sounds like a romantic night, or day.
Yeah, well, it was 10 a.m. in the morning, so... But, no, I mean, wow. once you go in that theater, it's dark, so it doesn't feel like daytime anymore.
Yeah, like when I walked out of the theater, it's like a pitch black theater, and I walked out and the sun's shining in my face. I'm like, God. I was expecting it just to be a bit dark, but no, the sun's still like up in the air. It's disappointing. We also saw the Zombieland Double Tap trailer, and that movie, I enjoyed the first Zombieland, but this movie looks a bit more like openly comedic than the original did. And I don't know, it looked okay, but I sort of hope it's not as much comedy as the trailer makes it look like.
I mean, the first one was decent, I guess, and
Are you not a Jesse Eisenberg fan?
He's okay, but he does rub me a little bit the wrong way. Like, a lot of his characters feel the same. I guess that's just,
his charm.
His person. Yeah, he has a certain charm to himself that he just can't shake no matter what character he's playing. He just always has that, I don't know, he looks like he needs a punch to the face.